Hello. Today I'd like to talk about the heights of being. So, the idea of the heights of being is an existential state which is tied to religion but which isn't limited exclusively to religion. Um, the heights of being is the idea of um, rising to a certain ontological state. If you think about the vertical axis of of existence, um, then the heights of being is what we should aim for in our life, not just tied to the sublime, which I mentioned previously, but also as a spiritual and religious goal. So, this is very closely tied to mysticism, and my personal history of mysticism goes quite far back. Um, at the age of about 16, I first began my interest in spirituality, broadly speaking, and I read the New Age authors like Deepak Chopra and Eckhart Tolle, and that was my first foray into spirituality. And I've always had interest in mysticism, but it started with Eastern mysticism. So I read the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita and the Tao Te Ching and all of these works. Um, then I went into Buddhist scriptures like the Dhammapada and the Lotus Sutra and the Diamond Sutra. And there's a very strong, almost external emphasis on mysticism in the East. And gradually I adapted my beliefs towards Christianity. And Christianity has more of an esoteric approach to mysticism. It's not on the surface necessarily, but there's many Christian figures of mysticism, and even the most famous, the three most famous, Saint Paul, Saint Augustine, and Saint Thomas Aquinas, were all mystics of a certain degree, and there's more overt mysticism uh, Dionysius the Areopagite, who was a 5th century writer who based his beliefs on a mixture of Christianity and Neoplatonism. And Neoplatonism is really a lot of the impetus for the Christian mysticism um, of of Augustine, for example, who's a pivotal figure. He was very influenced by Neoplatonism and many other figures. And Neoplatonism is um, probably one of the um, original ideas of a personal ascent to the one, ultimately, the one being God, although in their belief it's an impersonal God. And this was obviously adapted in Christian times. But yeah, so you think of reaching the heights of being, that's ultimately about advancing in mysticism. Like you've got the threefold way, the purgative, illuminative, and unitive, and that following that path will ultimately take you further and further into mysticism. And when you compare human experience from prior ages to today, there's a massive difference. I mean, today was so superficial and just living life on the surface, and everything's about sex and consumerism and gratification, instant gratification, and in their prior ages, which were influenced strongly by the Christian system of thought, then there's really an otherworldly aspect to it, and especially with Catholicism, like pre-Reformation Catholicism, and even in post-Reformation times to a lesser extent. But there's a there's a great emphasis on inward being and inward progression along the spiritual path, and really we've lost a lot of that in today's culture, although we can still reclaim it by reading the classics and living an introversive life focused on the spiritual path. So that's still technically possible, even though the surrounding culture has changed so much. And really, it's about the life of the mind, and the life of the mind must involve spiritual practice, really. Now, it's somewhat disappointing that so many people have left traditional religion, because traditional religion is the foundation of the spiritual life. And you've got like meditation and contemplation, meditation being more of a discursive reflection, and contemplation being a pure experience of God. And then you've got study as well, extensive study of the saints and their works, and that helps you on the mystical path, because it gives you the intellectual ideas to progress, and some of it's almost self-help, like with Teresa of Avila as well. The what was it? The Inner Castle or something like that. Different stages of the castle, going to higher spiritual states. So yeah, the heights of being is closely tied to mysticism, and I believe all this focus on travel, for example, like what's the point of uh, of travel necessarily, or what's the point of going out all the time necessarily? Because what does that give to your existential self? It doesn't further your existential goals, your ontological goals. It's entirely on the horizontal axis of life. It doesn't take into account the true depth and meaning of life, and that can only be achieved through spiritual experience. So reaching the heights of being should be our goal through a traditional religion like Catholicism, and that for me is the single most important thing, and that is my driving impetus in life, to go further on the spiritual path and to attempt a mystical life. And yeah, that's above all what I aim for. So thank you for watching.